She was the last surviving member of one of the most influential groups in music history, the Mamas and the Papas. But decades after their songs defined an entire generation, Michelle Phillips would be the one to finally lift the veil on a secret that shook the foundations of rock and roll. The mystery of Mama Cass Elliot's daughter and the identity of her real father. A truth Cass took to her grave. Michelle never set out to be the keeper of such a secret. To the world, she was the face of California beauty, the woman who embodied the light, the freedom, and the music of the 1960s. But behind the sunlit photographs and soft harmonies was a story filled with obsession, betrayal, and heartbreak. The kind of story that could only have been born in the chaos of fame. The deeper you look, the more the perfect image of Michelle Phillips begins to fracture. A childhood shadowed by confusion, a marriage entangled in drugs and jealousy, and a revelation that would change how the world remembered an entire generation of artists. What she revealed years later would shock even those who thought they knew everything about the Mamas and the Papas. It was a secret buried under layers of silence, and the truth, when it came, was almost too heavy to bear. Don't take your eyes off this video if you want to uncover the full, shocking truth. Because behind the beauty, behind the fame, behind the harmony, lies the story that Hollywood never wanted you to hear.
Before the lights, before the fame, before the tangled loves that would define her, she was simply Holly Michelle Gilliam, a child of two worlds, learning early that beauty often grows from chaos. She was born in Long Beach, California on June 4, 1944, into a home where affection and conflict lived side by side. Her father, Gardner Burnett Gilliam, was a man of contrasts, disciplined and magnetic, proud of his Texas roots, but restless to the point of recklessness. Her mother, Joyce Poole Gilliam, was delicate, kind, and easily overwhelmed by her husband's intensity. The marriage could never last. When it ended, Gardner took Michelle and crossed into a different world entirely, Mexico City in the 1950s. It was a city alive with rhythm, street vendors shouting over car horns, guitars echoing from cantinas, and the scent of chili and diesel in the humid air. For a young blonde American girl, it felt like stepping into another planet, dazzling and strange, full of danger and color. Gardner was determined to mold his daughter into someone strong. He taught her to speak clearly, to never show weakness, to be brave even when she didn't feel it. But Michelle's memories of him are layered: admiration, fear, confusion, and a deep longing for calm that never came. Her father's love was fierce but fractured. He could be protective and tender by day, then unpredictable by night. Michelle later said that he brought home one woman after another, as if he couldn't stand the silence. Behind the always closed bedroom door, she heard voices, laughter, and sounds she didn't understand, only that they left her uneasy, her innocence slipping away in the dark. That's when I learned love could be loud, selfish, and still called love, she recalled years later. Mexico shaped her in ways she wouldn't realize until much later. She learned Spanish fluently, made friends easily, and grew comfortable in rooms full of strangers. The city taught her to adapt, to smile, even when she felt lost. But it also gave her a restless heart, one that could never stay still for long. At school, she stood out, the tall, fair-haired girl who seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere. Teachers adored her confidence. Boys adored her beauty. But inside, she carried a quiet ache, the memory of a mother's absence and the uncertainty of a father's love. On warm nights, she would stand on the small balcony of their house, watching the lights flicker across the hills. She imagined another life, somewhere far away where the noise stopped and the air smelled of salt and dreams. California called to her like an old song. When she finally returned as a teenager, she wasn't the same girl who had left. Mexico had toughened her, softened her, and left a mark on her soul, a blend of discipline and defiance that would define the woman she'd become. By 16, she was bold, intelligent, and unafraid to walk into any room. She didn't yet know that the next room she entered would hold John Phillips, the man who would make her a star, a wife, and a ghost of her own freedom.
When Michelle returned to California, the sun felt different. It wasn't just warmth, it was a promise. The beaches of Los Angeles shimmered with youth and rebellion. The air was electric with music, Bob Dylan's words, the Beatles' harmonies, and that new California sound that was shaping a generation. She was barely 17 when she met John Phillips, a man twice her age, brilliant, magnetic, and dangerous in the quietest way. John was already married with children, but Michelle didn't yet understand boundaries. She only understood connection. He was everything her father had been, and everything she thought she could control this time. Intelligent, powerful, impossible to resist. Their connection was instant. John saw in her a beauty that could captivate a crowd. She saw in him a mind that could turn chaos into melody. He became her mentor, her lover, her husband, and eventually her undoing. By 1962, they were married. By 1965, they were making history. Together with Denny Doherty and Cass Elliot, they formed the Mamas and the Papas, a harmony so perfect it felt otherworldly. Their songs became the soundtrack of a decade: California Dreamin', Monday, Monday, Go Where You Wanna Go. Each note carried that sweet ache of longing, the sound of a generation searching for freedom and finding heartbreak. But inside the band, freedom came with a price. John ruled like a quiet storm. He was creative, visionary, but controlling to the point of cruelty. Michelle, young and full of life, began to feel the walls closing in. Still, on stage and in the studio, their chemistry was undeniable. Michelle's voice blended effortlessly with Cass's warmth and Denny's emotion. She didn't have the biggest voice, but she had the kind that lingered, breathy, intimate, almost hypnotic. The camera loved her. So did the magazines. In a world full of free love and flower crowns, Michelle Phillips became the face of California beauty. But fame and love have a way of corroding each other. John's admiration for Michelle's beauty turned into jealousy. He wanted her to be loyal, perfect, his muse. Yet he was surrounded by temptations of his own. The marriage began to twist into something darker, a mix of music, drugs, and manipulation disguised as art. They toured, recorded, and fought, all in the same breath. Cass Elliot, the heart of the group, watched it all unfold. She loved Denny, who loved Michelle, who was still trying to love John. It was a circle of affection and betrayal so tightly wound that every harmony began to sound like pain. And yet, when the lights came on, they sang like angels. Audiences didn't hear the arguments, the tears, or the tension that filled the studio. They only heard magic. And for a few years, that illusion held everything together. In those moments, Michelle felt alive. She felt seen. She believed in the dream they were selling to the world, a dream of peace, love, and perfect harmony. But dreams fade, and the higher you climb, the harder the fall. By the late 1960s, the golden glow of the Mamas and the Papas began to flicker. Drugs had crept in. Egos had swollen. The free love movement that once promised liberation was now just another trap. John grew distant, controlling, paranoid. Michelle began to rebel, quietly at first, then unmistakably. She started finding comfort in others, people who listened, who saw her more than a muse. And among them was the one man she wasn't supposed to love, Denny Doherty. Their affair would be the spark that blew apart the harmony of an era.
It began quietly, the kind of secret that hides in glances, in laughter that lingers too long, in words left half-spoken. Denny Doherty had always been kind to Michelle. He saw her differently, not as John's wife or the band's beauty, but as someone fragile and hungry for warmth. And in the chaos that surrounded the Mamas and the Papas, warmth became its own form of rebellion. Michelle had tried to fight it. She knew what it meant to cross that line, but Denny's charm was disarming, and his voice, the same one that sang beside hers every night, carried the same loneliness she felt. One night their harmonies bled into something more. It wasn't planned, it wasn't right, but it felt inevitable. "We were all searching for love in the same room," Michelle would say years later, and sometimes the songs blurred into real life. When John found out, the fallout was instant. He was furious, not just betrayed, but humiliated. The man who controlled every note of their music suddenly couldn't control the one thing that mattered most to him, Michelle. The tension inside the band became unbearable. Rehearsals turned into arguments, studio sessions dissolved into silence. Cass Elliot, who had loved Denny in secret, was devastated. She tried to hold the group together, but every harmony now carried a crack that couldn't be patched. John fired Michelle. For a brief time she was out, replaced by another singer, Jill Gibson. But audiences didn't buy it. Without Michelle, the Mamas and the Papas looked incomplete, like a photograph with one corner torn away. And so she was brought back, the prodigal muse returning to the very cage she had tried to escape. Backstage, the smiles were rehearsed, the affection mechanical. On stage, they performed Monday Monday, California Dreamin', Words of Love, songs that now felt like ghosts of a lost time. The press called them the sound of sunshine, but inside, the band was collapsing. By 1968, the magic was gone. The dream had burned itself out. John and Michelle's marriage disintegrated completely, swallowed by resentment, drugs, and the kind of silence that no song could fill. She filed for divorce, young, famous, and already exhausted by a lifetime of living too fast. John spiraled into bitterness. He accused her of betrayal, of vanity, of destroying the band. But behind the anger was grief, the grief of a man who had built a world around a woman and then lost her to the same freedom he had promised her. Cass Elliot went solo, her powerful voice carrying the ache of everything they'd lost. Denny tried to move on, but the guilt lingered in his songs. And Michelle, she smiled for cameras, walked red carpets, appeared in films, but inside she carried the wreckage of what the Mamas and the Papas had been. The band would reunite briefly in the early 1970s, trying to reclaim what was already gone. The harmonies were there, but the heart was not. Fame had given them everything, and taken everything with the same hand. As the decade faded, so did the dream. The California sound, once so pure, so innocent, had become the soundtrack of disillusionment. And for Michelle, the years that followed would bring new lovers, new scandals, and one devastating loss that would bind her forever to the ghost of Mama Cass. "I've lived 1,000 lives," she once said, "but every one of them began and ended with the music." She didn't know it yet, but her story was far from over. And the greatest secret she carried, the one that would shake the foundations of rock history, was still waiting in the shadows, buried under grief and silence. The end of the Mamas and the Papas wasn't just the end of a band. It was the collapse of an entire era, a generation that had sung about peace and love, only to drown in its own excess. And in the middle of it all was Cass Elliot, the voice that had carried their music higher than any of them could have imagined. Cass had always been the soul of the group, brilliant, generous, and painfully lonely. She adored Denny, even after he'd fallen for Michelle. She adored Michelle too, despite everything. There was no room in Cass's heart for hatred, only sadness and exhaustion. When the band dissolved, each of them went their own way. Cass pursued a solo career, her voice soaring again, finally free to tell her own story. Michelle acted in films, moved through Hollywood circles, and built a reputation as the last surviving spirit of a dream gone wrong. But something between them, Cass and Michelle, remained unspoken. In 1974, Cass flew to London for a series of solo performances at the Palladium. She was radiant, triumphant, and finally at peace. But one night, after a performance that brought the audience to its feet, she returned to her flat in Mayfair and never woke up again. At just 32, the heart that had carried so much love simply stopped. The world mourned her as the big-hearted singer of California Dreamin'. But behind the headlines, there was a deeper sorrow and a secret that Cass took with her to the grave. Cass had left behind a daughter, Owen Vanessa Elliot, a child she fiercely protected from public curiosity. For decades, the world believed no one knew who the girl's father was. Cass herself had refused to reveal it, telling even her closest friends that the truth didn't matter. But years later, Michelle Phillips would break the silence. She had promised Cass she would always look after Owen, and she did. Michelle became a second mother to the little girl, raising her alongside her own children, protecting her from the noise of fame. But one question lingered, unspoken, for decades. Who was Owen's real father? Rumors swirled for years. Denny Doherty, Mick Jagger, even John Sebastian. The music world speculated endlessly. Cass never said a word. Until one day, long after Cass was gone, Michelle revealed the truth. In a quiet interview, she pulled back the curtain on one of rock's greatest mysteries. Owen's father, she explained, was Charles Wayne Day, known as Bo, a session guitarist who had played with the Mamas and the Papas and countless other artists of the era. Bo had died young in the 1990s, long before the secret was spoken aloud. And Cass, who had carried so much pain and pride, had taken that truth with her to her final breath. Cass wanted to protect everyone, Michelle said softly. She wanted her daughter to grow up without shame, without gossip. She carried that burden so the rest of us wouldn't have to. The revelation didn't bring scandal, it brought closure. Fans who had adored Cass wept at the tenderness of it all, that a woman who had given her voice to the world had also given her silence to protect her child. And through it all, Michelle remained the keeper of that story, the last living witness to a time when music and love were the same language. By then, Michelle had already lived a dozen lives: actress, singer, survivor. She'd seen friends rise and fall, lovers come and go. She'd watched the counterculture she helped build fade into nostalgia and myth. But Cass's death left a mark she could never erase. Every time she heard "Dream a Little Dream of Me," she said it felt like Cass was still singing, not from the stage, but from somewhere above, reminding her that even broken harmonies can echo forever.
Time has a way of softening even the sharpest memories, but for Michelle Phillips, the past never truly faded. It just changed color. When the echoes of the Mamas and the Papas quieted and the chaos of the 1960s turned into legend, Michelle was still there, living proof that some dreams survive their own destruction. In the years that followed, she rebuilt herself piece by piece. She stepped into acting, appearing in films like Dillinger and Valentino, and on television in Knots Landing. She wasn't just the pretty face from the album covers anymore. She was a woman who had lived through fame, heartbreak, and survival. Hollywood tried to define her again and again, but she no longer belonged to anyone's story but her own. She kept her promise to Cass Elliot, raising Owen with the same fierce loyalty Cass once gave to everyone she loved. Their bond became something almost spiritual, a bridge between the past and the future, between music and memory. Whenever journalists asked about the 60s, Michelle would smile that same soft smile, wistful, wise, and slightly sad. "It was beautiful," she'd say, "but it was never simple." Even now, when the songs of the Mamas and the Papas play, California Dreaming, Monday, Monday, dedicated to the one I love, people feel a strange mixture of joy and melancholy. The harmonies sound eternal, but they were built from pain, love, and loss, and Michelle was there for every note. Outliving her bandmates made her both a witness and a survivor. She became the guardian of their story, the truth-teller for a time that so many have mythologized. She's spoken candidly about John's genius and cruelty, about Cass's kindness, about Denny's charm and heartbreak. She's not afraid of the truth anymore. She carries it like a badge, knowing that the past can't hurt her the way it once did. As the decades passed, Michelle never stopped being connected to that era. At festivals, documentaries, and tributes, she stands as the last voice from a dream that once changed music forever. She talks about love and freedom with a kind of earned peace, as someone who has seen how both can heal and destroy. "The 60s were magic," she once said, "but magic always comes with a price. We all paid ours." Michelle Phillips remains radiant, the living embodiment of a time when voices could change the world and beauty was as fragile as a song. She's not just a survivor of a generation, it's storyteller, the last woman standing in a story built on music, love, and the cost of both. And though the people she once sang with are gone, their harmonies still drift through the air, eternal, haunting, and human. Because as long as there's a song like California Dreaming, the story of Michelle Phillips and the secret she carried will never truly end.